Proverbs 24. Let's call this one Sketches and subtitle it Excuses, in this chapter that seems to once again give us 12, not so much commands, but possibly 12 instructions, at least 2 of which take a more positive spin on wisdom, but the rest taking what seems to be a more cautionary approach to the wisdom offered in this chapter, where we won't so much take it by the same kind of blocks and sequence that we did before, understanding that this chapter likewise seems to organize itself in blocks of wisdom as opposed to verses or individual proverbs of wisdom. But let's look at them by theme, understanding that the 3 cautionary type proverbs that stood out to me fall into the category of envy, scheming, and the title excuses. But first things first, the upside of wisdom seems to be in the way in which it can benefit you in good times, meaning that the way in which a house is built, at least to the degree that it is built effectively, is by wisdom. The way in which war is waged effectively is by wisdom. However, the downside is wisdom is one of the things that can kind of be a snoozer for what he's going to say in the last verse of that section, the foolish, in verses roughly 3 through 7. In roughly verses 13 through 14, he's going to say, just as honey can be sweet to the palate, likewise, if you wait and you're patient enough, you may find that wisdom is likewise as sweet, and it has the added benefit of providing you a hope and a future beyond the immediate benefit that simply comes by having your eyes opened. Another portion of the Proverbs that isn't quite as cautionary, but helps us understand the way in which we can learn lessons by witnessing as opposed to having to experience hard times, is probably the last section of the chapter that goes from verses 30 through 34. However, the more cautionary versions of these Proverbs seem to deal with, like I said, on the one hand, envy in verses 1 through 2. It's going to again remind us to not get wrapped up in envying the evil. There are people who seem to be winning by cutting corners, ethical corners, or corners with their integrity, which seems to be similar to a warning he gives in verses 17 and 18, where that whole concept of envying those who are doing wrong can have 2 effects. 1, it can tempt us to want to join them. 2, it can tempt us to be too wrapped up in wanting to see them fail. So in verses 17 and 18, he is going to say, don't rejoice when your enemy falls. Whereas verses 19 and 20 are, in a related way, going to say, do not fret over the wicked or envy the evil of the wicked, giving us a look at that other temptation, which is the temptation to join them, understanding that over and over again, the reason why the word tells us to be patient is you don't want to get too impressed with the front end of doing wrong, that you forget about what comes around on the back end. On the other hand, scheming is another thing he is going to warn us about in these verses, where in verses 8 and 9, he's going to seem to talk about the dangers of scheming behind the backs of others in general. He's particularly going to warn about the dangers of scheming against the righteous in verses 15 and 16. And he's not going to talk about scheming as much as falling into the habit of disrespecting or dishonoring God or the king. He says that to the degree you find the company of those who've gotten into the habit of diminishing the significance of God and the king, that might be a time in which, as we have seen in previous Psalms and Proverbs, you might want to consider setting up healthy boundaries. But going on to the excuse passages, verses 10 and 12 are going to help us to understand that beyond our duty to simply be righteous and maintain our own integrity, we have a responsibility to look out for one another, and in certain circumstances to rescue one another and not make an excuse for neglecting to take care of one another when we have the opportunity and the ability to do so. So there are times when God doesn't necessarily expect us to risk ourselves for others. However, that is not a blank check to always sit back and throw our hands up and make excuses in situations when we can help. And once again, walking closely with God, or as we might more simply state it, seeking his counsel, can help us understand circumstances in which we would be wise to help and not lean into excuses. As he's going to, in verses 23 through 26, warn us against making excuses that would justify the wicked for whatever reason, understanding that sometimes a personal affinity or a personal relationship can cause us to make excuses for those who are doing wrong. Verses 23 through 26 seem to be warning us against the temptation to make excuses when truth and candor are really what's appropriate. And similarly, in verses 28 and 29, he's going to seem to caution against the temptation to make excuses for spinning a narrative against your neighbor when you feel like you have been wronged. He's warning us once again of things that we have heard going back to previous Proverbs, previous Psalms, and quite possibly all the way back to Genesis, how even though it can be hard to tell the truth, genuine safety, enduring safety is found in the truth, even when we may find it personally unflattering. Which is why we sometimes say God's best to us as we go forward in him, God willing, begging him for the strength to lean into the truth when, quite honestly, it's just easier to make excuses.